Hey guys, settle here. Tonight we began why medieval people trusted rumors more than authority, but before we get started make sure that you subscribed and comment me where are you watching from. Medieval people did not distrust authority because they were rebellious. They distrusted authority because authority kept lying to them. Not always maliciously. Not always intentionally. But consistently. When a medieval lord announced that taxes were increasing, it was never because the harvest had failed or the treasury was empty. It was because God demanded it. Or because tradition required it. Or because asking questions was dangerous. And when the explanation never matched lived experience, people learned something valuable. Official stories were optional. Rumors, on the other hand, were efficient. A rumor didn't need to be polite. It didn't need to protect anyone's status. It didn't need approval. It only needed to explain what people were already seeing. If grain disappeared, rumor explained where it went. If a noble died suddenly, rumor explained who benefited. If soldiers arrived at night, rumor explained what authority refused to admit. And rumor traveled faster than proclamations ever could. Town criers spoke when allowed. Rumors spoke constantly. They passed through taverns, bakeries, confessionals, wells, and fields. They moved through women more than men, because women were everywhere men pretended not to notice. Markets. Births. Deaths. Kitchens. Sickbeds. Rumors didn't come from nowhere. They came from pattern recognition. Medieval people were excellent at noticing patterns. If a tax collector arrived before soldiers, people remembered. If monks asked too many questions before an arrest, people noticed. If a bishop left town days before plague arrived, people whispered, and whispering was safer than writing. Writing was permanent. Whispering vanished with the wind. Which is why authority feared it. Kings issued laws against spreading false talk. Church councils condemned idle speech. Punishments existed for disturbing the peace. None of it worked. Because rumor was not entertainment. It was intelligence. When a medieval villager heard that 3 towns over, children were being conscripted, they didn't wait for confirmation. They hid their sons. When a traveler said the roads ahead were unsafe, people believed him over any official map. Maps were drawn by people who never walked. And when authority contradicted rumor, rumor usually won. Because rumor had witnesses. Authority had parchment. This is why medieval governments struggled to control public opinion. They had power. They had weapons. They had legitimacy. But they didn't have trust. Trust had to be earned daily. And it rarely was. The church suffered from this more than anyone. From the outside, it appeared unified. From the inside, it was chaos. Priests contradicted each other. Bishops disagreed. Monasteries followed different rules. Sermons changed depending on politics. People noticed. So when a priest declared something sinful, villagers waited to see if it stayed sinful. If it changed next year, rumor adjusted accordingly. Truth, in the medieval mind, was flexible. Authority claimed certainty, but reality proved otherwise. Rumor admitted uncertainty. And that honesty mattered. A rumor could say, I don't know, but this feels wrong. Authority could not. Authority had to sound confident even when guessing. And people could tell the difference. This is why conspiracy thinking flourished. Not because medieval people were gullible, but because they were adaptive. They lived in a world where official explanations routinely failed. So they created their own. Not as fantasy. As survival strategy. If authority said a famine was divine punishment, rumor said merchants hoarded grain. If authority said a war was righteous, rumor said it was about land. If authority said executions were just, rumor said they were convenient. And often, rumor was closer to the truth. Medieval Europe did not run on faith alone. It ran on shared suspicion. That suspicion kept people alive. Suspicion was not loud in the Middle Ages. It was quiet. Careful. Practiced. People learned early that surviving meant knowing what not to say out loud. So rumors developed rules. You never accused directly. You implied. You asked questions that answered themselves. You told stories about someone else that everyone understood were about the local lord. Rumor spoke sideways. And because it spoke sideways, it spread safely. A peasant could say, "Strange how the bishop left before the sickness arrived," without ever accusing the bishop of anything. But everyone listening understood the implication. Understanding was communal. That made it powerful. Authority spoke downward. Rumor spoke laterally. Which meant it trusted no single source. A rumor was never believed because one person said it. It was believed because 5 unrelated people said versions of the same thing. Medieval people were constantly cross-referencing reality. If a merchant mentioned trouble on the road, and a monk avoided eye contact when asked about the same route, and soldiers suddenly appeared near the gates, rumor connected the dots. Authority hated dots being connected. Which is why they tried to control speech. But controlling speech in a mostly illiterate society is like trying to cage smoke. You can't seize what isn't written. And rumor thrived especially where authority was weakest, at the edges. Border towns. Trade routes. Ports. Places where people came and went. Travelers were dangerous because they carried information without allegiance. A merchant didn't care who ruled your town. He cared whether he'd survive the next one. So he told stories. About cities burning. About kings dying. About armies moving before announcements were made. And people listened. Because travelers had no incentive to lie in the same direction as authority. Which made them more trustworthy. This is why medieval governments feared wandering storytellers, minstrels, and beggars. Not because they entertained, but because they transmitted unfiltered information. A song could carry a rumor across an entire region in weeks. And songs were harder to punish. You could arrest a man. You couldn't arrest a melody everyone already knew. So rumor embedded itself into culture. Proverbs. Jokes. Folk tales. Stories about greedy lords. Clever peasants. Foolish kings. On the surface, entertainment. Underneath, instruction. Children learned early who not to trust by listening to stories that pretended to be harmless. Authority underestimated this constantly. They believed power came from decrees, but influence came from repetition. And rumor repeated endlessly. Even the church, with all its sermons, couldn't compete. A sermon happened once a week. Rumor happened every hour. In kitchens. Fields. Bedrooms. And confessionals. Which was the church's greatest mistake? Confession was designed as control. A way to extract information under the promise of forgiveness. But it worked both ways. Priests heard everything. And priests talked. Not publicly. But privately. One priest would mention something to another. A monk would repeat it to a traveler. A traveler would share it in a tavern. And suddenly, confidential knowledge became common knowledge with no identifiable source. Rumor had deniability. Authority did not. This is why medieval people often believed rumors about leaders more than the leaders themselves. A king claimed loyalty. Rumor watched behavior. A noble promised protection. Rumor counted soldiers. A bishop preached humility. Rumor noticed the size of his wine cellar. Medieval people trusted their eyes more than words. And rumor was just shared eyesight. This didn't mean all rumors were true. Many were wrong. Some were cruel. Some destroyed innocent lives. But even false rumors followed logic. They explained fear. They filled gaps. They answered questions authority refused to. Which meant rumor became the default explanation engine. If something happened suddenly, rumor explained why. If something didn't happen when promised, rumor explained who interfered. Authority explanations were slow and sanitized. Rumors were immediate and raw. And immediacy mattered more than accuracy when survival was at stake. This is why medieval Europe never truly believed its own propaganda. People pretended to. They nodded. They attended. They obeyed publicly. But privately, they trusted what they heard whispered. Every village had unofficial experts. The old woman who remembered past famines. The man who traveled further than most. The widow whose husband died conveniently after a land dispute. These people weren't in power. Which made them valuable. They had no reason to protect the official narrative. So people listened. And when multiple unofficial experts agreed, rumor hardened into truth. Authority could scream. Rumor only needed to murmur. And murmurings last longer. This is why conspiracy thinking didn't destabilize medieval society. It stabilized it. People prepared for worst-case scenarios quietly. They hid food. They delayed travel. They avoided certain people. All based on rumor. And most of the time, it worked. Which reinforced trust in rumor over authority even further. By the time the Black Death arrived, rumor networks were already in place, and they noticed something terrifying before officials admitted anything. People were dying along trade routes first. Ports went silent. Ships arrived with fewer crew. Rumors spread faster than plague carts. And those who listened lived longer. Authority told people to pray. Rumor told people to leave. Authority said God would protect the faithful. Rumor said distance mattered. And distance turned out to be correct. Which permanently shattered trust. After the plague, medieval Europe never fully believed authority again. They complied. But belief was gone. From that point forward, rumors didn't just explain events. They predicted them. And prediction is power. Prediction changed everything. Once people realized rumors could arrive before official announcements, they stopped waiting for permission to act. They trusted early signals. A locked monastery gate. A missing tax collector. A merchant refusing to enter town. These weren't coincidences. They were warnings. And medieval people became experts at reading warnings because ignoring them was lethal. Authority always arrived late. By the time a proclamation was nailed to the church door, the outcome was already decided. Rumor arrived first because it didn't require approval. Which meant medieval life slowly reorganized around unofficial knowledge. Markets adjusted prices based on whispers. Travelers rerouted themselves without maps. Families quietly prepared for events no one was allowed to acknowledge yet. This was not rebellion. This was adaptation. Authority interpreted it as disobedience because authority couldn't admit it was behind. So rulers blamed unrest. The church blamed sin. Lawmakers blamed moral decay. Rumor blamed cause and effect. And cause and effect usually won. This is why medieval authorities tried to criminalize false news. But false compared to what? Official announcements often contradicted reality. A king would declare a war victorious while refugees arrived in waves. A bishop would announce stability while soldiers seized grain. Rumor didn't need to be polite. It didn't need to preserve morale. It just needed to be accurate enough to be useful. And usefulness is the real test of truth in desperate societies. This is why medieval conspiracy theories were grounded in logistics. They weren't abstract. They focused on food, movement, money, power. If grain disappeared, someone took it. If soldiers moved, someone ordered them. If a noble died, someone benefited. Rumor asked the question authority refused to answer. Who gains? This question terrified medieval institutions. Because the answer was usually visible. And visibility erodes mystique. Kings relied on mystique. The church relied on mystery. Rumor stripped both. And once stripped, authority had to rely on force. Which made rumor even more believable. Violence confirmed suspicion. If authority reacted harshly to speech, it suggested speech was dangerous because it was correct. Executions silenced individuals, not ideas. And martyrdom only strengthened rumor networks. People remembered names. They remembered timing. They remembered who benefited afterward. Which fed the next rumor. This feedback loop never stopped. By the late Middle Ages, rumor had become infrastructure. An invisible system running parallel to official governance. And in many places, more reliable. Guilds relied on it. Merchants depended on it. Families trusted it. Even nobles listened privately while pretending not to. A lord might publicly dismiss tavern talk, then secretly change plans because of it. This double life was common. Public obedience. Private skepticism. Which meant medieval Europe functioned on two levels at all times, the official world. And the real one. And rumor lived in the real one. This duality shaped everything. Laws were written knowing they wouldn't be fully followed. Rules were enforced selectively. Punishments were symbolic. Everyone knew this. Which is why rumor mattered more than law. Law stated ideals. Rumor described practice. If a law existed but rumor said it wasn't enforced, people ignored it. If rumor said enforcement was coming, compliance appeared instantly. Rumor didn't need courts. It just needed credibility. And credibility came from being right often enough. This also explains why medieval people tolerated contradictory rumors. They understood probability intuitively. Not every rumor was true. But enough were true to justify attention. So people weighed them. They compared sources. They remembered who was usually accurate. Medieval villagers ran informal credibility networks without writing anything down. A man who exaggerated too often lost influence. A woman whose warnings proved accurate gained authority. Reputation was everything. Which is ironic, because rumor is often portrayed as reputation's enemy. In reality, it enforced it. If someone behaved cruelly, rumor preserved the memory. If someone betrayed trust, rumor made sure no one forgot. Official justice was slow. Rumor justice was immediate. Which frightened elites. Because rumor could punish without permission. And it did. Merchants lost customers. Officials lost cooperation. Priests lost confessions. Not through rebellion. Through quiet withdrawal. Which is harder to suppress. You can punish protest. You can't punish silence. This is why medieval people learned to listen more than speak. Listening kept you informed. Speaking got you noticed. And being noticed by authority was rarely good. So people listened. And rumor adapted again. It became subtle. A raised eyebrow. A phrase said twice. A pause before answering. Meaning was conveyed without words. Authority couldn't intercept that. Which meant rumor evolved faster than control mechanisms. And it stayed ahead. This is why medieval conspiracies feel strangely modern. They weren't fantasies about hidden monsters. They were frameworks for understanding power. Who controls resources? Who moves unseen? Who benefits quietly? The same questions people ask now. Just without the internet. Instead, they had each other. And each other turned out to be enough. This dependence on each other created a strange outcome. Medieval people became deeply communal and deeply suspicious at the same time. They trusted their neighbors more than their rulers. But they watched their neighbors carefully. Trust was conditional. You trusted someone because they shared risk with you. Because they would starve if you starved. Because they would burn if you burned. Authority did not share risk. When plague came, lords fled. When famine struck, officials still collected taxes. When war erupted, peasants fought and nobles negotiated. Rumor noticed this imbalance. And imbalance breeds explanation. Which is why conspiracy theories in the Middle Ages rarely accused abstract forces. They accused specific people. Not demons. Not fate. People. Names were whispered. And names stuck. This was dangerous. Because once rumor decided someone was responsible, proof became irrelevant. The logic was simple. If suffering exists and someone benefits, that person is guilty. This logic powered medieval justice far more than law ever did. It's why tax collectors were hated. Why moneylenders were feared. Why healers were suspected. Visibility plus advantage equaled blame. Which explains why some of the most skilled people were also the most endangered. A healer who cured too often attracted attention. A merchant who prospered during famine looked suspicious. A monk who knew too much made people uneasy. Rumor rewarded moderation. Be useful, but not exceptional. Successful, but not conspicuous. Excellence was dangerous. Authority praised excellence publicly. Rumor punished it privately. This tension shaped behavior. People hid skill, they downplayed knowledge. They pretended ignorance when it was safer. And rumor enforced this quietly. If someone crossed the line, whispers followed. Not accusations. Whispers. And whispers had weight, because no one could confront them directly. You can fight an accusation. You can't fight a feeling everyone shares. This is why medieval people feared being talked about more than being punished. Punishment ended. Rumor lingered. And rumor didn't need resolution. It could remain unfinished forever. Which is why authority struggled to counter it. They could issue verdicts. They could declare innocence. But rumor didn't require legal closure. It required narrative satisfaction. If the story made sense, it stayed. This also explains why medieval people accepted contradictory truths. Someone could be innocent by law and guilty by rumor simultaneously. And both states could coexist. Authority demanded singular truth. Rumor allowed multiplicity. Which made it more adaptable. This flexibility is why rumor survived institutional collapse. When governments fell, rumor continued. When bishops died, rumor adapted. When cities burned, rumor migrated. It lived in memory. And memory was the only archive most people had. So rumor became history. Not written history. Felt history. What people remembered. What they warned their children about. What they avoided repeating. Official history preserved victories. Rumor preserved lessons. Which meant rumor was often more accurate in practice. It taught people which roads were dangerous. Which families to avoid marrying into. Which promises meant nothing. Authority didn't care about those details. Rumor did. This is why medieval people listened more carefully to failure than success. Triumphs were exaggerated. Disasters were instructive. If a village was destroyed, rumor explained how. If a rebellion failed, rumor explained why. And those explanations shaped future behavior. Authority tried to erase failure. Rumor preserved it. Because failure was useful. This is why medieval Europe didn't repeat mistakes endlessly. It adapted slowly, painfully, but adaptively. And rumor was the mechanism that it's also why medieval conspiracies often sound bleak rather than fantastical. They weren't hopeful narratives. They were cautionary ones. They didn't promise salvation. They promised survival. Trust no one completely. Watch patterns. Listen more than you speak. These weren't paranoid slogans. They were rational responses to unstable systems. Which is uncomfortable to admit. Because it suggests paranoia can be healthy under certain conditions. And medieval Europe provided those conditions constantly. Power was opaque. Rules were inconsistent. Violence was arbitrary. In that environment, skepticism was wisdom. Rumor wasn't rebellion. It was literacy. Just not the kind taught in monasteries. It was the ability to read people. To read timing. To read absence. And absence was often the loudest message. When authority said nothing, rumor filled the silence. And silence was frequent. Because admitting uncertainty threatened legitimacy. So authority stayed quiet. Rumor did not. Which meant rumor often spoke first. And first impressions matter. By the time authority responded, people had already adjusted. This pattern repeated for centuries. And by the end of the Middle Ages, it was ingrained. Early modern states tried to centralize power. They built bureaucracies. They standardized law. But rumor adapted. It moved into pamphlets. Songs. Later, print. But its core stayed the same. Shared skepticism. Which means medieval people weren't irrational for trusting rumors. They were pragmatic. They trusted the system that responded fastest to danger. And that system was each other. This collective pragmatism created an uncomfortable truth for anyone in power. The people were not ignorant, they were observant. They simply did not trust systems that refused to explain themselves. And medieval systems rarely explained anything. Decisions arrived without context, orders came without reasoning, punishments appeared without warning. So people filled in the gaps. Not randomly. Logically, that if a new law benefited nobles, rumor assumed noble pressure; that if a priest changed doctrine, rumor assumed politics; that if soldiers arrived suddenly, rumor assumed trouble long before it was announced. These assumptions weren't cynical guesses. They were based on experience. Experience teaches faster than instruction. Which is why medieval rulers struggled to regain trust once it was lost. Trust is cumulative, suspicion is permanent. Authority could do 10 things right and 1 thing wrong, rumor would remember the wrong thing. Because wrong things hurt. And pain sharpens memory. This is why medieval people passed down warnings instead of praise. They remembered which bridge collapsed, which lord betrayed them, which treaty failed. Praise fades. Danger imprints. And rumor is the imprint. This also explains why medieval Europe produced so many legends about treacherous rulers and false promises. Those legends weren't entertainment. They were mnemonic devices. They encoded experience into story so it wouldn't be forgotten. A tale about a king who broke his oath wasn't about that king. It was about all kings. Authority tried to counter this with ceremony. Crowns, processions, symbols. The goal was emotional control. To make power feel inevitable. But inevitability doesn't prevent hunger. And ceremony doesn't stop soldiers. So rumor persisted underneath the spectacle. People watched what happened after the procession. Did taxes rise? Did grain disappear? Did men vanish? Those outcomes mattered more than words. Which made rumor brutally empirical. It tracked consequences. And consequences rarely aligned with official narratives. This misalignment created a permanent low-level distrust that never fully resolved. Even when authority was competent, rumor assumed failure was coming. Not because people wanted disaster. Because they had learned to expect it. This expectation became cultural. Parents taught children caution, guilds taught apprentices discretion, communities taught newcomers to listen first. Speaking too soon marked you as naive, listening marked you as safe. This is why medieval socialization emphasized silence. Children were told to observe, women were told to overhear, men were told to hold their tongues. Silence wasn't submission. It was information gathering. And rumor fed on gathered information. It assembled fragments. Small observations. Nothing dramatic. A door locked early. A meeting held late. A stranger staying too long. None of these mattered alone. Together, they formed narrative. And narrative guided behavior. Which is why medieval people often acted decisively with very little explicit evidence. They didn't need proof. They needed plausibility. And plausibility was built communally. This also explains why medieval people tolerated ambiguity. They didn't need certainty to act. They needed consensus. If enough people felt something was wrong, action followed. Not protest. Preparation. Which kept communities alive. Authority interpreted this as irrational fear. But fear that keeps you alive is not irrational. It is calibrated. Medieval rumor networks were calibrated by suffering. They adjusted after every failure. After every famine. After every war. Which made them resilient. Authority structures collapsed repeatedly. Rumor did not. It adapted to feudalism. To monarchies. To church dominance. It existed before states. It survived states. And it will outlive them. Which is perhaps the most unsettling realization. Medieval people trusted rumors more than authority because rumor was accountable. If a rumor was wrong, people suffered and corrected it. If authority was wrong, people suffered and authority blamed something else. God. Fate. Sin. Rumor blamed humans. And humans can change behavior. God rarely sends apologies. So rumor became the default operating system. Unofficial. Unwritten. Uncontrollable. And deeply human. It didn't claim to be perfect. It claimed to be necessary. Which made it believable. This is why medieval conspiracies feel grounded. They weren't about secret monsters ruling the world. They were about ordinary people abusing power quietly. Which is less comforting, but more realistic. Medieval people didn't need grand villains. They already knew small ones. And rumor kept track of them. Not with precision. But with memory. Which was enough. Because memory shapes caution. And caution keeps you alive. That is why rumor mattered more than authority. Not because authority was always wrong. But because authority was rarely honest about being wrong. And honesty, even imperfect honesty, builds trust. Rumor admitted doubt. Authority denied it. So medieval people chose the voice that sounded like their own. Quiet. Uncertain. Shared. And in doing so, they survived a world that gave them very little reason to believe anyone in charge. Survival shaped belief more than doctrine ever could. When people live long enough under unstable authority, they stop asking whether something is officially true and start asking whether it is useful. Usefulness became the real measure of credibility. A warning that arrived too late was useless, no matter how authoritative it sounded. A whisper that arrived early was valuable, even if it was incomplete. So medieval people learned to live inside uncertainty. They didn't demand full explanations. They demanded enough information to adjust. This is why rumor often sounded vague. Something is coming. Something is wrong. They're moving men. These weren't failures of clarity. They were deliberate. Vagueness protected the speaker. Specifics could be punished. Implications could not, and implication invited collective interpretation. Which distributed responsibility. No one person could be blamed for the conclusion, because everyone reached it together. This is how rumor stayed alive in environments hostile to dissent. It was never owned. It was shared. Authority couldn't arrest a feeling, and feelings are where rumor lived. Which made medieval populations emotionally literate in a way modern people sometimes underestimate. They paid attention to tone. To hesitation. to inconsistency. They noticed when voices changed. A guard who suddenly avoided eye contact. A priest who rushed through a sermon. A lord who postponed a feast. These deviations mattered. Routine was safety. Change was signal. Rumor tracked signals relentlessly. This is why medieval communities often reacted to invisible threats before visible ones. They sensed tension. They felt instability. And they acted preemptively. Authority, bound by procedure, lagged behind. Procedure requires confirmation. Rumor requires intuition. And intuition develops under pressure. Centuries of pressure sharpened it. This does not mean medieval people were always correct. They weren't. But they were rarely passive, and passivity is far deadlier than error in unstable worlds. A wrong rumor might make you hide unnecessarily. Ignoring a correct one could kill you. So medieval culture favored false positives over false negatives. Better to flee a threat that doesn't exist than ignore one that does. This bias shaped everything. It shaped migration, marriage, trade. It shaped which towns grew and which emptied. Which is why medieval maps look strange. Cities appear abandoned without explanation. Villages vanish between records. Rumor moved people without paperwork. And movement is power. Authority prefers populations to stay put. They can be taxed, counted, controlled. Rumor encourages mobility, which undermines control. So authorities try to fix people in place, through obligation. Through fear. Through law. But rumor slipped through boundaries. It didn't need permission to cross borders. And borders were porous anyway. Which meant medieval Europe was far more fluid than official history suggests. People moved constantly. They followed opportunity. They fled danger. And rumor guided both. This constant motion confused authority. Records were always outdated, censuses were inaccurate. Which further reduced trust. If authority didn't even know who was present, why trust what it claimed to know? Rumor exposed this ignorance. It revealed that rulers were guessing. And guessing undermines legitimacy. Legitimacy requires certainty. Which is why medieval institutions pretended to be omniscient. They weren't. People knew it. And rumor kept score. Every incorrect prediction weakened authority. Every unfulfilled promise reinforced skepticism. Over time, belief eroded into compliance. People obeyed not because they believed, but because they calculated risk. Obedience became transactional. Not moral. Not spiritual. Practical. And rumor informed those calculations. It told people when obedience was necessary and when it was performative. When to nod. When to hide. When to leave. This created a society skilled in surface conformity and private independence. Which frustrated rulers endlessly. They sensed disloyalty but couldn't locate it. Because it wasn't organized. It wasn't articulated. It was ambient. And ambient resistance is almost impossible to crush. You can crush rebellions. You can't crush attitudes. Rumor shaped attitude. It didn't call for overthrow. It called for caution. And caution erodes power slowly. Which is why medieval states expanded violently but ruled delicately. Too much pressure caused flight. Too little caused disobedience. And rumor constantly recalibrated that balance from below. This is why medieval authority often seemed paranoid. It was reacting to a force it couldn't see. A network with no leaders. No headquarters. No ideology. Just shared experience. Which is the most resilient system humans have ever created. This system didn't die with the Middle Ages. It evolved. But its foundation was laid then. In kitchens. Fields. taverns that in whispered conversations after sunset. In pauses before answers. In glances exchanged when officials spoke too confidently. Medieval people trusted rumors more than authority because rumor respected their intelligence. It didn't demand belief. It invited participation. And participation creates ownership. Which is why rumor mattered. And still does. Participation changed the relationship people had with truth. Truth was no longer something handed down. It was something assembled. Piece by piece. Person by person. Which meant truth felt earned. Authority delivered conclusions. Rumor delivered process. And process builds confidence. Medieval people didn't need certainty, they needed coherence. They needed explanations that fit what they saw, heard, and felt. When official narratives fractured that coherence, rumor repaired it. Sometimes crudely. Sometimes unfairly. But always functionally. This is why medieval conspiracies often sound internally consistent even when factually wrong. They obeyed emotional logic. They made sense of chaos. And sense-making is a survival function. A world without explanation feels hostile. Rumor softened hostility by naming it. Which made fear manageable. You can't fight unnamed terror. But you can prepare for a known enemy, even if that enemy is imagined. Authority often misunderstood this. They thought rumor created panic. In reality, panic came from silence. From delayed information. From unexplained decisions. Rumor reduced panic by filling the void. Even bad explanations are less frightening than none. Which is why people often clung to grim rumors rather than hopeful official statements. Hope without evidence felt like manipulation. Fear with logic felt honest. This preference shaped medieval psychology profoundly. People became suspicious of optimism. Too much reassurance sounded false. A leader who promised safety invited doubt. A neighbor who warned of danger invited trust. This inversion confused elites. They couldn't understand why their speeches failed, they blamed ignorance. They blamed malice. They blamed superstition. They rarely blamed themselves. And rumor noticed that too. Blame avoidance is a signal. And signals feed rumor. Over time, medieval people learned to interpret the emotional behavior of authority. Not just actions. Tone. Urgency. Hesitation. When a ruler spoke too calmly during crisis, rumor assumed deception. When clergy argued publicly, rumor assumed deeper fracture. When proclamations contradicted observable reality, rumor discarded them entirely. This selective listening was not passive. It was analytical. People filtered information based on reliability, not status. Which is why rumor networks often identified danger before officials. They weren't smarter. They were less constrained. They didn't need consensus from above. They responded to weak signals. Which is how complex systems survive. Medieval Europe was a complex system. And rumor was its nervous system. Sending alerts. Triggering reflexes. Coordinating response without central command. Authority acted like a brain with delayed response. Rumor acted like reflex. You pull your hand from fire before your brain decides why. Rumor did that for communities. Which is why it persisted even when suppressed. You can't suppress reflex. Only consciousness. And medieval authority focused entirely on consciousness. Doctrine. Law. Speech. They ignored instinct. Which continued operating beneath control structures. This mismatch explains countless medieval failures. Why armies marched into disasters despite warnings. Why cities resisted rulers they technically obeyed. Why reforms failed even when well-intentioned, because authority addressed structure. Rumor addressed feeling. And feeling drives behavior more reliably than structure ever has. This also explains why medieval people often distrusted written information. Writing was static. It couldn't adapt. Rumor adapted constantly. If conditions changed, rumor changed. It corrected itself. Slowly. Imperfectly. But faster than parchment. Which meant oral culture had advantages. It responded in real time. Authority relied on fixed messages. And fixed messages age poorly. So medieval people listened more than they read. And remembered more than they recorded. Memory became infrastructure. Which is why trauma shaped culture so deeply. Events like famine, plague, and war permanently altered rumor networks. They left scars. And scars influenced future interpretation. After plague, any sudden illness triggered alarm. After war, any troop movement triggered flight. These reactions weren't irrational. They were learned. Which is why rumor often overreacted. But overreaction preserved life. Underreaction killed. This bias toward caution became tradition. Passed down. Reinforced. Even when conditions improved. Which meant medieval societies often acted like disaster was always imminent. Because it often was. Authority tried to calm this by normalizing crisis. God wills it. Such things happen. But normalization doesn't remove memory. Rumor kept memory active. An active memory resists complacency. Which frustrated elites who wanted predictability. Predictable populations are easy to govern. Alert populations are not. So authority tried to exhaust people. Through labor. Through obligation. Through ritual. Fatigue reduces vigilance. But fatigue also increases dependence on community. Which strengthened rumor networks further. People talked while working. While resting. While surviving. And survival conversations always matter more than official ones. Which is why medieval rumor networks outlived kings. Outlived dynasties. Outlived doctrines. They were not tied to belief systems. They were tied to human needs. Safety. Predictability. Control. And those needs never disappear. This is why medieval people trusted rumor. Not because it was perfect. But because it was human. And human systems, flawed as they are, respond faster than institutions. Human systems also forgive inconsistency in ways institutions cannot. A rumor could be wrong yesterday and useful today. Authority could not afford that flexibility. When authority contradicted itself, it collapsed credibility. When rumor contradicted itself, people adjusted. They understood context. They understood that circumstances change. This contextual awareness made rumor feel alive. Authority felt rigid. And rigidity breaks under pressure. Medieval people lived under constant pressure. So they gravitated toward what bent instead of what snapped. Rumor bent. It evolved as conditions shifted. Which meant it could absorb shock. A failed harvest. A surprise invasion. A sudden death. Rumor adjusted its explanations. Authority often froze. Which created a lag. And in that lag, people acted independently. This independence was quiet but transformative. It meant medieval societies were less centralized than they appeared. Power looked concentrated at the top. Behavior was not. Daily decisions, where to go, who to trust, what to hide, were made locally. Based on shared interpretation. Based on rumor. Which means medieval Europe functioned less like a pyramid and more like a web. Connections mattered more than rank. Trust mattered more than title. Authority underestimated this repeatedly. They issued orders assuming compliance, they got performance. People obeyed visibly while ignoring privately. Which preserved stability on the surface. And adaptability underneath. This dual structure explains why medieval societies endured extreme shocks without total collapse. Plague killed millions. Yet communities reformed. Wars devastated regions. Yet trade resumed. Authority alone could not have managed this. Rumor networks coordinated survival informally. They told people where food could be found. Which towns were safer. Which authorities could be negotiated with. This knowledge didn't appear in records. But it shaped outcomes. Which means official history misses half the story. The part where people kept each other alive. This invisible labor of information sharing was never acknowledged. Because acknowledging it would admit that authority was not sufficient. And sufficiency is essential to legitimacy. So rumor remained unofficial. Uncredited. Unrewarded. Yet indispensable. This is why medieval rulers oscillated between ignoring rumor and fearing it. They couldn't decide whether it was harmless noise or existential threat. Sometimes it was both. Rumor could stabilize a region. It could also destabilize it. Which made it unpredictable. Authority prefers predictability. So they tried to regulate speech. Through punishment. Through moral condemnation. Through fear. But regulation rarely works on necessity. And rumor was necessary. This tension produced cycles. Suppression. Adaptation. Resurgence. Each cycle refined rumor's methods. People learned what words triggered attention. They learned how to speak indirectly. They learned to embed messages in humor, song, and complaint. Complaint was especially effective. Complaining appears harmless. Everyone complains. Which makes it an ideal carrier for information. A complaint can reveal scarcity. Danger. Injustice. Without accusation. So medieval rumor often traveled as grievance. Not theory. Not ideology. Just dissatisfaction. Which felt relatable. And relatability builds trust. Authority dismissed complaints as whining. But whining contains data. Data authority ignored. Which allowed rumor to stay ahead. This dynamic shaped medieval politics profoundly. Popular uprisings rarely started with ideology. They started with shared complaints. Bread prices. Conscription. Abuse. Rumor synchronized dissatisfaction. Authority was always surprised when unrest erupted. People weren't. They had been talking about it for months. Quietly. Which is why medieval revolts often seemed sudden but were actually predictable. Rumor provided the timeline. Authority refused to read it. And so history repeated. Again and again. This repetition reinforced trust in rumor. Each ignored warning validated the network. Each surprise crisis proved the system worked. So people relied on it more. Which widened the gap between rulers and ruled. This gap never fully closed. Even in periods of reform. Because reform still flowed from above. Rumor flowed horizontally. And horizontal systems are harder to dismantle. They don't require leadership. They require participation. Which medieval life encouraged. People lived close together. Worked together. Shared resources. Shared risk. Which created constant communication. Silence was rare. And rare silence was noticeable. Which meant absence of information became information. If no rumors circulated, people grew anxious. Silence meant something was being hidden. Which was often correct. So rumor became a comfort. Not because it was reassuring. But because it meant awareness continued. Awareness equals control. Even partial control is better than none. Which is why medieval people trusted rumor. It gave them agency. Authority took agency away. Rumor returned a portion of it. Enough to make life navigable. Not safe. But survivable. And survival was the ultimate metric. Survivability reshaped morality itself. When people rely on rumor to stay alive, ethical purity becomes secondary to practical wisdom. Medieval people were not obsessed with being right. They were obsessed with not being dead. Which is why rumor did not care about fairness. It cared about patterns. If a group consistently caused harm, rumor labeled it dangerous. If an individual repeatedly benefited from chaos, rumor marked them. This wasn't justice. It was triage. And triage is ruthless by necessity. Authority demanded moral clarity. Good versus evil. Loyalty versus betrayal. Rumor operated in gradients. Probably safe. Potentially dangerous. Avoid when possible. This nuanced categorization made everyday life manageable. People didn't need verdicts. They needed guidance. And guidance came from experience shared communally. This also explains why medieval people tolerated contradictions in character. A lord could be cruel but reliable. A priest could be corrupt but protective. A merchant could be dishonest but useful. Rumor reflected this complexity. Authority flattened it. Flattening breeds resentment. Because lived reality is never simple. Rumor respected that. Which made it feel honest. This honesty extended to acknowledging ignorance. Rumor often included uncertainty openly. I don't know why, but. It might be nothing, but. These phrases invited caution without demanding belief. Authority rarely admitted uncertainty. And certainty without accuracy destroys trust. So medieval people gravitated toward voices that sounded like their own internal doubts. Those voices came from peers. Not from pulpits. Not from thrones. This peer-based validation strengthened social cohesion. People felt seen. Understood. Heard. Which reduced alienation. Ironically, rumor reduced fear more effectively than reassurance. Reassurance dismissed concern. Rumor engaged it. Engagement builds resilience. Which is why medieval societies endured relentless stress without total psychological collapse. They talked. Constantly. About danger. About injustice. About suspicion. Talking did not eliminate fear, but it distributed it. Fear shared is fear diluted. Authority hoarded fear. Rumor spread it thin. And thin fear is manageable. This dynamic explains why medieval people were both deeply anxious and strangely functional. They lived with constant threat. But they processed it together. Rumor was therapy. Crude. Imperfect. But communal, which made it powerful. This is why attempts to silence rumor often backfired. Silencing conversation removed the safety valve. Anxiety built. Pressure increased. And eventually exploded. Authority learned this lesson repeatedly and still forgot it. Because control is seductive. It promises order. But order imposed without understanding produces fragility. Rumor introduced messiness. But messiness absorbed shock. This tension between order and resilience defined medieval governance. Rulers wanted obedience. Communities wanted survival. Rumor bridged the gap. It allowed people to appear obedient while acting cautiously. Which maintained surface stability. And prevented deeper collapse. In this way, rumor wasn't subversive. It was stabilizing. It prevented rash rebellion by offering alternative responses. Hide instead of fight. Leave instead of protest. Wait instead of resist. These choices avoided bloodshed. Authority mistook silence for loyalty. But silence was strategy. And strategy is intelligence. Which means medieval people were far more strategically aware than history often credits. They didn't lack knowledge. They lacked power. So they used what they had. Information. Shared quietly. Which is the most ancient form of power humans possess. This power never appears in chronicles. It doesn't have names. It doesn't have monuments. But it shapes outcomes. Which is why medieval conspiracies often feel understated. They don't promise domination. They promise awareness. They don't offer heroes. They offer warnings. And warnings save lives. That is the function rumor served. Not truth for its own sake. But preparedness. Preparedness is the difference between survival and annihilation. And medieval people learned this lesson repeatedly. So they trusted the system that prepared them best. Even when it was uncomfortable. Even when it was wrong. Even when it was cruel. Because authority offered order without safety. Rumor offered uncertainty with options. Options matter. Which is why medieval people trusted rumor more than authority. Not because authority was always lying. But because rumor never pretended not to be guessing. And guessing honestly is better than asserting falsely. That lesson did not vanish with the Middle Ages. It simply changed form. And the habit of listening sideways never disappeared. It adapted. Just like rumor always does. Adaptation is the final reason rumor outlived every medieval institution. Institutions are built for specific conditions. Rumor is built for change. When borders shifted, rumor adjusted overnight. When alliances dissolved, rumor recalibrated. When belief systems fractured, rumor absorbed the pieces. Authority required time. Rumor required attention. Attention is cheaper than time. And medieval people had more attention than authority ever realized. They watched. They listened. They compared. Small inconsistencies mattered. A gate closing early. A market price changing too fast. A priest skipping a sermon. A messenger arriving alone. These were signals. Rumor connected them. Authority saw them as noise. Noise, when patterned, becomes information. Rumor specialized in pattern recognition. Not consciously. Collectively. Which is why no single person controlled it. And no single person could be blamed. This made rumor resilient to punishment. You can imprison a speaker. You cannot imprison a pattern. Which frustrated rulers. They tried to find leaders. There were none. They tried to identify authors. There were only repeaters. They tried to stop circulation. But circulation was behavior, not infrastructure. Walking. Talking. Waiting. All of life moved rumor. So rumor became invisible. It hid in ordinary interaction. Which made it unstoppable. This invisibility also shaped identity. People learned to separate public self from private interpretation. They said one thing. Believed another, planned a third. This compartmentalization was not hypocrisy. It was survival. And it trained populations in cognitive flexibility. Which made them harder to dominate. Because domination requires predictable belief. Rumor disrupted predictability. Constantly. Even when nothing changed. Which kept people mentally agile. This agility allowed medieval societies to transition between eras, from pagan to Christian. From feudal to mercantile. From local to imperial. These shifts appear sudden in history. They were not. Rumor softened the ground long before authority moved. Ideas circulated informally first. Tested. Adjusted. Only then did institutions adopt them. Which means rumor functioned as a prototype system. A testing ground for belief. Bad ideas died quietly. Good ideas spread invisibly. By the time authority noticed, adoption was already underway. This is why heresies terrified the church. Not because they were false. but because they spread without permission. Permission is authority's currency. Rumor ignores currency. It trades in relevance. And relevance cannot be decreed. It must be earned. So rumor became the shadow economy of meaning. Operating alongside official doctrine. Sometimes conflicting. Sometimes aligning. But always independent. This independence preserved mental autonomy. Even when physical autonomy was impossible. A serf could not leave the land. But he could choose what explanation to accept. That choice mattered. It preserved dignity. Which is why medieval people fiercely defended their stories. Stories were ownership. To lose your story was to lose yourself. Authority offered replacement stories. Grand. Ordered. Sanitized. But they didn't fit experience. Rumors' stories did. They were messy. Inconsistent. Emotionally true. Which is why they survived. This emotional truth mattered more than factual precision. Because emotion dictates action. And action determines outcome. History records outcomes. Not feelings. So it misses the engine. Rumor was the engine. Driving migration. Resistance. Compliance. Adaptation. Every major medieval event has a rumor history underneath it. Plague panic. Crusader mobilization. Peasant revolts. Religious schisms. Remove rumor, and these events make no sense. They appear irrational. But with rumor, they become coherent. People acted on the best information they believed they had. Which is all anyone ever does. Authority demanded obedience without belief. Rumor provided belief without authority. Belief wins. Every time. This is the quiet lesson medieval Europe teaches. Control speech, and speech adapts. Control belief, and belief escapes. But engage belief, and society stabilizes. Authority never fully learned this. So rumor endured. And it will always endure. Because as long as humans face uncertainty, they will share interpretations. Quietly. Urgently. Together, what ultimately mattered was not accuracy, but usefulness. Medieval people judged information the way sailors judge wind. Not by whether it is pure. But by whether it moves you safely. Rumor that failed was discarded. Rumor that helped survived. This natural selection refined collective judgment over generations. Bad patterns faded. Good warnings persisted. Which means rumor evolved. Slowly. Organically. Without oversight. Authority never trusted this evolution because it couldn't control it. But control is not the same as coordination. Rumor coordinated behavior without command. And coordination is far more powerful. Entire villages could decide to leave before danger arrived. Entire markets could shift before decrees were issued, entire regions could grow hostile long before rebellion became visible. These movements looked spontaneous. They weren't. They were premeditated at the communal level. Just not centrally planned. This decentralization confused chroniclers. They looked for leaders. They found crowds. They assumed madness. It was preparation. This misunderstanding persists in historical analysis. We still frame medieval populations as reactive. They were anticipatory. They read signs. They interpreted silence. They trusted collective instinct over official reassurance. And instinct, sharpened by repetition, becomes intelligence. Which is why medieval rumor networks resembled early warning systems, they detected instability faster than any messenger. They transmitted urgency without hierarchy. They bypassed bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is slow by design. Slow systems create blind spots. Rumor filled those blind spots. Even when it was wrong, it forced movement. And movement prevents stagnation. Stagnation kills. Which is why rumor was rarely neutral. It pushed people to act. Hide. Leave. Prepare. Distrust. Action mattered more than explanation. Explanation could come later. Survival could not. This urgency shaped medieval temperament. People were decisive. Sometimes brutally so. Hesitation was dangerous. Authority demanded patience. Rumor rewarded initiative. This tension defined everyday ethics. Is it better to wait for permission or act on suspicion? Medieval people chose suspicion. Because suspicion had a better survival record. Which is why trust was conditional. Always provisional. Earned repeatedly. Never permanent. Authority assumed permanent trust. Once sworn, always loyal. Reality did not work that way. Oaths were formal. Belief was practical. And practicality overrides ceremony when lives are at stake. This explains why medieval loyalty often appeared fickle. It wasn't. It was contingent. People remained loyal as long as protection held. When protection failed, allegiance shifted. Rumor tracked these failures meticulously. It remembered broken promises. It archived betrayals. Not in books. In memory. And memory is ruthless. Forgiveness requires safety. Safety was rare. So memory persisted. This long memory shaped collective behavior. Entire families avoided certain routes. Entire regions distrusted certain symbols. Entire generations inherited caution without knowing its origin. This is how trauma becomes culture. Rumor was the transmission mechanism. Which means rumor carried history more faithfully than chronicles ever could. Chronicles preserved events. Rumor preserved consequences. Consequences matter more. Because they shape future decisions. This is why medieval people often seemed pessimistic. They weren't pessimistic. They were informed. They had seen patterns repeat. They expected recurrence. Which is rational. Authority framed recurrence as disorder. Rumor framed it as probability. Probability thinking kept people alive. Certainty thinking got them killed. So medieval societies quietly trained themselves in probabilistic reasoning. Not mathematically. Emotionally. They learned to weigh risk. To hedge. To prepare multiple outcomes. This sophistication is rarely acknowledged. Because it wasn't formalized. But it was real. And it was widespread. Which is why rumor never disappeared even when literacy increased. Writing did not replace it. It joined it. Written notices became another signal to interpret. Not an absolute. People read between lines. They compared proclamations with whispers. And when they conflicted, whispers won. Because whispers came from peers. And peers share risk. Authority rarely shared risk. They were insulated. And insulation breeds distrust. This distrust was not ideological. It was experiential. People trusted those who suffered alongside them. Rumor came from suffering. Authority spoke from distance. Distance dilutes credibility. Always has. Which is why medieval people leaned toward proximity-based truth. If you saw it, it mattered. If someone you trusted saw it, it mattered. If a distant voice declared it, it was questionable. This hierarchy of evidence was logical. And it persists today. Technology changed speed. Not psychology. So when we ask why medieval people trusted rumor, the answer is simple. Rumor spoke in the language of survival. Authority spoke in the language of control. Survival always wins. Control, in the medieval world, was always late. By the time authority reacted, something had already gone wrong. A famine had begun. A road had become unsafe. A lord had stopped paying soldiers. Rumor arrived earlier. Not because it was magical, but because it lived closer to the ground. Shoes noticed shortages before ledgers did. Voices noticed fear before proclamations did. Markets noticed instability before councils did. This proximity made rumor uncomfortable for those in power. Because it meant truth was forming without permission. And truth without permission is dangerous. Especially in a world built on hierarchy. Hierarchy requires belief. Not belief in facts, but belief in structure. Rumor undermined structure by flattening it. Everyone could know something. Everyone could contribute. Everyone could adjust behavior accordingly. This terrified medieval elites more than rebellion. Rebellion was visible. Rumor was invisible until it wasn't. And by then, it was too late. Which is why authorities tried to criminalize it. Edicts against spreading false news. Punishments for malicious speech. Public executions meant to silence tongues. They failed. Because rumor doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs relevance. And relevance was abundant. Every plague, every war, every bad harvest fed it. Silencing rumor is like silencing weather. You can punish the observer. The storm still comes. So medieval rulers tried something else. They tried to use rumor. They planted it. They leaked it, they whispered selectively. This is where medieval propaganda was born. Not in posters or speeches. In taverns. In confessionals. In markets. A priest casually mentions divine displeasure. A merchant repeats a convenient story that a soldier complains loudly within earshot. These weren't accidents. They were tests. If the rumor spread, it worked. If it died, it failed. Information warfare before the term existed. This was crude. But effective. And deeply cynical. Because once authority learned to manipulate rumor, trust eroded further. People knew manipulation existed. They just didn't know when it was happening. So skepticism increased. People cross-checked stories. Compared versions. Noted inconsistencies. Medieval critical thinking didn't look like philosophy. It looked like suspicion. Suspicion is intelligence under pressure. And pressure was constant. This environment produced a strange paradox. The more authorities tried to control information, the more skilled the population became at interpreting it. Obfuscation trained detection. Propaganda trained skepticism. Silence trained imagination. And imagination, when fed fear, becomes powerful. Which is why medieval Europe was so psychologically intense. Everything meant something. Nothing was neutral. A closed gate. A delayed sermon. A missing noble. Signals everywhere. People became semioticians without knowing the word. They read the world like a coded manuscript. Because it was one. This constant interpretation exhausted people. Mental fatigue was real. Which is why supernatural explanations thrived. They simplified complexity. Instead of tracking 10 political variables, you could blame demons. Demons were efficient explanations. Wrong. But efficient. Efficiency matters when survival drains cognition. So conspiracy thinking wasn't stupidity. It was compression. Reducing overwhelming data into actionable stories. Stories allow action. Ambiguity paralyzes. This explains why medieval conspiracies were so vivid. They weren't meant to be accurate. They were meant to motivate behavior. Fear moves faster than nuance. And medieval life rewarded speed. Which brings us back to paranoia. Paranoia is often framed as irrational fear. But paranoia is pattern detection under uncertainty. Too much pattern detection creates false positives. Too little creates vulnerability. Medieval people erred on the side of too much. Because false positives were cheaper than false negatives. If you falsely suspected poison, you skipped a meal. If you failed to suspect poison, you died. This asymmetry shaped psychology. Better anxious than dead. Better suspicious than loyal. Better prepared than correct. Modern society forgets this logic because our risk structure is different. But medieval logic was internally consistent. Which is why mocking it misses the point. Their world punished trust. It rewarded vigilance. And vigilance becomes paranoia when threats are constant. So when we read about medieval fear, we should not ask, why were they so paranoid? We should ask, what incentives shaped that paranoia? The answer is simple. They lived in a system where betrayal was common. Information was scarce. And consequences were irreversible. In such a system, caution is rational. Hypervigilance is adaptive. Suspicion is survival. This doesn't make medieval people noble or wise. It makes them realistic. Realism is uncomfortable. So later eras softened it. Romanticized it. Turned it into superstition. Because accepting that paranoia was rational forces an unpleasant realization. That under similar conditions, we would behave the same way. And often do. Which is why medieval paranoia feels familiar. Because it is. Just stripped of modern vocabulary. Replace demons with algorithms. Replace monks with intelligence agencies. Replace rumor with social media. The structure remains. Only the speed changes. The medieval world didn't disappear. It scaled. Scaling didn't make humanity calmer. It made anxiety louder. In the medieval world, fear traveled at the speed of footsteps. Today it travels at the speed of light. But the mechanism is unchanged. Information still arrives fragmented. Authority still reacts late. People still fill gaps with narrative. And narrative is the most ancient technology we possess. Medieval people didn't just consume stories. They lived inside them. Stories explained suffering. Stories assigned blame. Stories predicted outcomes. And stories justified action. This is why chroniclers mattered less than storytellers. A chronicler recorded what happened. A storyteller explained why it mattered. And meaning drives behavior. Always has. Which is why medieval conspiracy theories were sticky. They didn't just explain events. They gave people roles. Victims. Villains. Protectors. Traitors. Roles simplify chaos. Chaos terrifies. So roles were embraced. Even when wrong. Especially when wrong, because wrong certainty feels better than honest confusion. This psychological pattern shaped entire eras. And it was quietly exploited. Those who understood narrative gained influence. Not necessarily those in power. Sometimes outsiders. Sometimes radicals. Sometimes charlatans. A convincing explanation could override official truth. Because official truth lacked emotional resonance. It spoke in abstractions. People suffer concretely. They need explanations that touch daily life. Which is why medieval rumor favored personal detail. Names. Places. Specific actions. The Lord is greedy mattered less than. He raised the mill fee and his wife wears silver. Specificity signals authenticity. Always has. Which is why fabricated rumors include vivid details. They mimic memory. And memory is trusted. This blurring between memory and invention haunted medieval justice. Accusations carried weight because they felt remembered. Not because they were proven. This is why trials relied on testimony more than evidence. Evidence was rare. Testimony was abundant. And confidence was mistaken for truth. This dynamic empowered those skilled in storytelling. A good narrator could reshape reality. Which terrified institutions. Because institutions rely on fixed narratives. And fixed narratives collapse under competing stories. This is why medieval authorities obsessed over controlling sermons. The pulpit was a broadcast system. A priest could stabilize or destabilize an entire region. With words alone. Which is why heresy was treated as treason. Not because of theology. But because of narrative control. A heretic didn't just disagree. He offered an alternative explanation of reality. And explanation equals power. Which is why suppression was ruthless. Burning books wasn't about ignorance. It was about narrative elimination. Erase the story. Erase the threat. Except stories don't burn. They adapt. They go oral. They go underground. They become rumor. And rumor is resilient. This resilience is why conspiracy thinking never died. It changes shape. It evolves. It absorbs new fears. New villains. New technologies. But the structure remains. Because the human brain seeks coherence under threat. And coherence is story. This doesn't mean medieval people were uniquely gullible. They were operating with limited data and high stakes. Their error margin was narrow. Which made them decisive. Decisiveness looks like extremism from a safe distance. But from inside danger, hesitation looks like death. This is why medieval justice was harsh. Why punishment was public. Why fear was institutionalized. Fear was a deterrent. But also a signal. Signals mattered. Everything mattered. Which created a feedback loop. More fear led to more rumor. More rumor led to more control attempts. More control led to more distrust. And distrust fed rumor. A self-sustaining cycle. Breaking it required trust. Trust required stability. Stability was rare. So the cycle continued. For centuries. Until conditions changed. Slowly. Painfully. With violence. But even then, the cycle didn't end. It merely transformed. Printing presses amplified rumor. Newspapers formalized it. Social networks digitized it. The medieval mind didn't vanish. It was inherited. Which is why studying medieval paranoia isn't academic curiosity. It's self-examination. Because the same pressures produced the same behaviors. Change the environment, and psychology follows. Change psychology, and behavior follows. But the underlying hardware stays. Which means the medieval world is not behind us. It is beneath us. Embedded. Waiting for uncertainty. Waiting for scarcity. Waiting for authority to falter. And when it does, rumor will rise again. Not as superstition. But as survival instinct. Because when official explanations lag, people will always build their own. And they will believe them. Because belief is not about truth. It is about usefulness. Usefulness is the quiet dictator of belief. Not logic. Not evidence. Not authority. Usefulness. A belief survives if it helps someone make sense of danger. That was true in the Middle Ages, and it is true now. Medieval people did not ask, "Is this true?" They asked, "What does this help me do?" Hide. Flee. Prepare. Blame. Endure. If a belief answered one of those questions, it stayed. If it didn't, it vanished. This ruthless filtering is why medieval conspiracy theories feel so refined. They weren't random, they were honed by necessity. Every useless fear faded. Every useful fear persisted. Which is why certain themes repeat endlessly. Poison. Betrayal. Hidden groups. Secret knowledge. Corrupt elites. These themes map perfectly onto real risks. They are exaggerated, not invented. And exaggeration is a survival feature that IT ensures attention. Attention saves lives. This exaggeration also explains why medieval fear targeted the marginal. Healers. Foreigners. Travelers. Scholars. People who move between worlds. Movement threatens order. Order feels safe. Which is why stationary societies distrust mobility. Mobile people carry information. Information destabilizes. So mobile people become suspect. This is why medieval Jews were accused of poisoning wells. Not because wells were actually poisoned. But because Jews traveled, traded, and knew things locals didn't. Knowledge asymmetry creates fear. Fear demands explanation. Conspiracy provides it. This pattern is ugly. But predictable. And predictable patterns can be manipulated. Which powerful actors learn quickly. Redirect fear. Choose the target. Control the narrative. Stabilize power. This manipulation was not centralized. It was opportunistic. Anyone with influence could exploit it. Which is why medieval politics were so volatile. Power rested on perception. Perception rested on story. Story rested on rumor. This fragile chain made governance unstable. Which is why medieval rulers obsessed over symbols. Crowns. Relics. Processions. Symbols create narrative anchors. They reassure. They signal continuity. Continuity calms people. Calm people don't question. But symbols are brittle. Once cracked, trust collapses fast. A king who fails once is suspected forever. Rumor remembers failure. Authority forgets it. This mismatch accelerates collapse. Which is why medieval reigns could end suddenly. Not because of one event. But because belief reached a tipping point. Belief doesn't degrade gradually. It snaps. Which is why medieval revolts seem abrupt. They weren't. They were preceded by years of quiet narrative shift. Whispers. Jokes. Songs. Sarcasm. The earliest rebellion is humor. When people laugh at power, power is already bleeding. Medieval satire mattered. It was dangerous. Which is why jesters were protected. They spoke truth under cover of absurdity. Even kings understood this. Sometimes. Until they didn't. And then heads rolled. Because truth threatens comfort. And comfort is addictive. Which is why those in power isolate themselves. Isolation reduces dissonance. But increases ignorance. Ignorance breeds miscalculation. Miscalculation fuels rumor. Rumor fuels instability. Again, the cycle. This recursive dynamic explains why medieval Europe never settled. It oscillated. Fear. Control. Resistance. Collapse. Over and over. Each generation inheriting trauma and tactics. Which shaped culture. Not consciously. Subconsciously. Caution baked into tradition. Distrust woven into custom. Silence taught as wisdom. Speech taught as danger. This produced societies that appear passive. They weren't passive. They were watchful. Watchfulness looks like stillness until it doesn't. And when it breaks violently. Because pressure was never released gradually. Only catastrophically. This is why medieval violence feels excessive. It was stored energy. Released all at once. Rumor compressed emotion. Emotion compressed action. And action exploded. Which is why understanding rumor is key to understanding medieval behavior. Not kings. Not wars. Not treaties. But whispers. Because whispers move first. Always.